In a podcast by a person named Prodigal John, he wrote an interesting piece about the not so small difference between a rescue and a recovery. And this is the piece that he wrote. No one I love have ever disappeared, physically speaking, anyway. No one in my family has ever gotten lost in the woods or vanished in a city. No boat has ever gone missing at sea. No horses returned home without a rider. But if they had, if someone disappeared, the first and perhaps worst sentence I could hear would be this: we're launching a search and recovery instead of a search and rescue. That doesn't seem like a big sentence, but it actually represents an important crossroad investigation when a team is searching for someone. It is at this point that they reveal what they truly believe about the missing person. You see, a rescue is an effort geared at saving someone's life, someone who is alive, and saving them from danger. A search and recover is an operation designed to retrieve a body of someone that has already lost the fight to a particular danger. You see, all too often in my life, he continues to say, I decide that certain people are not worthy of rescue. I give up on them. I leave them on the outside of the road and focus my day and search on recovery efforts. That's how things were with my friend Mac. He's an alcoholic. When a mutual friend called and told me he had been arrested for a DUI and was probably going to jail, I didn't care. When a friend asked me to help to raise money for his defense, I didn't give. When the same friend said Mac needed our spiritual support, I didn't pray. Mac was too far gone, I thought. Mac was a hopeless cause. Mac was at best a search and recovery. Give up on Mac already, I said to myself inside. Give up on Mac. Is there anyone in your life that you've given up on? Maybe your parents hated God. Maybe aside from God, because I don't think this is just a spiritual issue, he continues to write, they didn't even like you. Maybe all the love and forgiveness you have thrown at a person just gets thrown back to you. And so you don't try to rescue anymore. You would rather engage in a search and recovery effort. I've entitled my message for today, this second message from the book of Jonah, as Jonah's Search and Rescue. And I did that because I think that God uses this experience in the life of Jonah not only to transform the attitude of Jonah, but also transform the people of Nineveh. We left off last time in the story with the prophet Jonah. He was on the run, and he was attempting to escape from the presence of the Lord. It's interesting that Jonah is not a new convert. Jonah is not a new Christian. Jonah is not a new believer. Jonah is not new to the faith. He is a seasoned prophet of God. And yet in our text, we find this experienced, seasoned prophet of God running away from what God had called him to do and the people that God had called him to minister to. Jonah chose to go against God and against what God wanted for him and against what God wanted for the people of Nineveh. and he's gone his own way. But we also discover in the text that not only does Jonah make a choice, but God also makes a choice. God sent a great wind that threatened to break up the ship that Jonah was traveling on in Jonah chapter 1, verse 4. Jonah is thrown overboard and left to his own devices in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, but then God stepped in. And God was involved. God intervenes. He interferes. He intrudes not only to save the people of Nineveh, but God steps in to save and rescue Jonah. You see, this entire mess that Jonah found himself in, this difficulty began when Jonah chose to resist God's call, an attempt to run away. The old King James Version says that he was attempting to flee from the presence of God. He was trying to get away from the everywhereness of God. Until Jonah finds himself quite literally trapped. He was trapped with nowhere to go. Jonah, in that state, prayed from the stomach of the fish. Isn't it nice to know that the omniscience, the everywhereness of God assures us that there is no situation that we find ourselves in that God is not there with us. There's no place in our life where God is not present with us. The 139th Psalm, one of my favorite Psalms, says it this way: "Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or where shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend in the heavens, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and fly to the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand find me, and thy right hand shall guide me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me, even the darkness does not hide us from God." In his distress, the text reads that Jonah calls out to God, "Help!" And God answered. I cried for help in Jonah chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. I cried for help from the depths of Sheol, from the depths of hell. I cried, and God heard my voice. The distress that Jonah is talking about in the text, most of us, as we read the text, would assume it is the distress of being in the belly of the whale, but that's not what Jonah is talking about. Jonah is saying that in his distress, after the other people on the ship had thrown him overboard, in the distress of being in that water, he cried for God. And what does God do? God sends a fish as a search and rescue effort to save Jonah. To save Jonah. And so Jonah's current prayer is an acknowledgement that God heard and answered his prayer. Have you ever been in a place in your life like that, where you were distressed and you called for God and God answered? Has your back ever been up against the wall? I know that we have all of the connections we need, and many of us in this amazing country called America, we have most of the resources you need. But we all, some point in our life, face a situation that we can't get out of. My connections won't make it. My resources won't make it. My education in and of itself is not enough to get me out of this situation. My back is against the wall. In my distress, Jonah said, I cried, "Help!" And God heard me. In the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, Jonah describes the current has engulfed him and the billows were passing over him. Have you ever felt that way? Just things hitting you once after once and time after time. I don't know. Maybe I'm just talking to someone outside. Have you ever experienced, do you know someone that has ever experienced that? A death and a death and a death, an illness and illness and illness, crisis with the spouse, crisis with the children, crisis with finances, crisis with the job, bang, 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 bang. In my distress. We are good. We are very good at putting the mask on. And we come and we clean up pretty good. And you would never tell from our faces that difficulties go on in our life, but all of us experience them. We don't talk about them because we don't want to show our weaknesses. But we want to give the impression, I got it all together. And you might. You might be doing a great job of fooling yourself. Because all of us have times in our life where it feels like it's falling all apart. The divorce, the death, the denial of entrance into college, the denial of the job application, whatever the situation is. We all have times in our life where the back is against the wall, and that's what Jonah says. The currents are engulfing me, the billows are passing over me. And what does Jonah do? He says, I cried out to God. And Jonah's current prayer is an acknowledgement that God has answered. Isn't it good to know that when we cry out to God, God hears and God answers? He calls out to God in his distress. Jonah's current prayer suggests that his being swallowed up by the fish is God's response to his cry for help. Jonah cries, I'm going down for the third time. God sends a fish to rescue him. It's God's search and rescue. And there are a couple of lessons that I think that this text teaches us. Number one, I think it teaches us that when we cry out to God, God hears and God answers. Now, it doesn't guarantee that God is going to answer the way we want God to answer or in the time that God wants to answer, but God hears and God answers. That's number one. Number two, I think another lesson that this text teaches us is that people can change. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. Because some of us have dealt with some really tough people. People that we're ready to say, whatever. So I'm going to say it again. People can change. You see, this record reveals the power of God's word to transform people. But what's going to happen in this text is that we think that Jonah is only going to preach to the people of Nineveh in order for them to change. But what happens in the text is that God preaches to Jonah in order for Jonah to change before he goes to preach to the people of Nineveh. Something has to happen in Jonah's life before he goes and does what God has called him to do. And so Jonah had to change before he can preach change to the people of God. People can change. People can change. Secondly, and probably the most obvious lesson that this text taught me, and I hope you relate to it, is that we shouldn't wait until a crisis in our life. We shouldn't wait until a terrorist attack in our country before we find the need to appreciate and turn to God. I don't know what it was like at Palisades Lutheran Church the Sunday after 9/11, but there was standing room only at the church that I was serving. Everybody came out of the woodworks. Everybody was calling on Allah, Buddha, Muhammad. I don't care who you worship, somebody was looking for God to intervene. Why? Because there was a crisis. The test came back. You need to come to the office to get the results. It's a crisis. I need you to come and talk about these mortgage payments. It's a crisis. Well, I need to have a parent-teachers meeting in the office because your child was found with, it's a crisis. The text suggests to us that we shouldn't have to wait for a crisis in our life to find a need to appreciate God. Find a need to pray, to study our Bible. Crisis. This is something that's true for us. When things are going well, sometimes our prayer life can deteriorate. When things are going well, we can slack up on reading our scripture. Sometimes even take God and faith and church and worship and gathering together for granted when things are going well. Responsibilities, our time, our talents, our treasures, I'll get to it when I can. But then something comes and grabs our attention. Did you hear the news? Something comes and backs us up against the wall. We shouldn't wait for a crisis to hit before we return to God. Another thing that I think this lesson teaches us, and this is a little more comforting than that last point, is that God answers our prayers regardless of our guilt. Jonah was on the run. He was going in the opposite direction of what God had called him to go. God said, I want you to go to Manhattan, New York. And Jonah said, I want to go to Manhattan Beach, California. He was going in opposite direction. So when he found himself in the situation that he was in, he felt a little guilty. I'm running away from God. I'm being disobedient to God. And yet he cries out to God. And what does God do? Answer him in the middle of his guilt, in the middle of his shame. God said, I don't care what you've done. I don't care where you are. I care about you. I care about you. Jonah had been willfully exercising his own free will and gone against the will of God. And in spite of that, God still hears and answers him. He purchased a ticket. He got on the ship. He's heading in a different direction. And then the storm hits. God answers us in the middle of our guilt. I think there are at least two lessons that we can learn or know why God would rescue Jonah in spite of his guilt. And the first reason is that God is merciful. God is merciful. Will you say that with me? God is merciful. Okay, it's kind of easy. You echo me. I'll say it, then you say, God is merciful. The Bible declares in Ezekiel chapter 31, verse 11, that God takes no pleasure. God takes no pleasure in punishment. God rescues Jonah in spite of his guilt because God is merciful. And what was God trying to do? God was trying to teach Jonah mercy. See, if I was in Jonah's place, I would have said, I told you so. Yeah. Look what you got yourself into. Now, don't act like you all holy, because you would have done the same thing. You made this bed, so what? This is your mess. If you had listened, you wouldn't be there. Ask my kids. I probably said that a couple of times at home, but I told you so. I told you. And then we'll say, well, you got yourself into this? Come on now, come on, talk back to me just a little. Get yourself out of it. Except for the really holy ones among us, most of us would have said that. Yeah, right. God was trying to teach Jonah mercy. See, we all want to be on the receiving end of mercy. But sometimes it's hard for us to be on the dispensing end of mercy. And that's what God was trying to teach Jonah. Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh because he didn't want them to have mercy from God. He didn't want God to forgive them. He didn't want God to restore them. He didn't want God to reclaim them. He said, I'd rather that they go to hell. And so what does Jonah say? From the bottom of hell, in the middle of that fish, I cried to God, and God answers. So God says, if I can answer you while you're running away from me, if I can answer you while you're disobedient to me, then you ought to show some mercy to those people that you don't want to go to. Mercy. Final lesson I believe that we can gather from Jonah is this need for us to be thankful in the midst of the circumstances that occur in our life. Jonah was running from God. God pursued Jonah and rescued him. I shared this at the earlier service, and I wrote in my notes, I want to share it again here, because when did Katrina happen? I don't remember the year Katrina happened, but whenever Katrina happened, there was this huge contingency of people who were going to hold a convention in where the New Orleans Saints play, whatever the stadium, football, Superdome. And I was actually invited to be one of the speakers there. And I was asked to speak on hope. So I'm flying on America West Airlines from Scottsdale, Arizona to Louisiana. No one I'm with, and no one except for my wife at the time, knew where I was spiritually, because my intent was, when I returned from this trip, I was going to tenure my resignation at the church that I served and become a hospital chaplain. I had made it up in my mind. I'm through with parish ministry. It's just, it was just too overwhelming. It was too demanding, blah, 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 blah. I'm sitting on the airplane, aisle 7, seat A. The flight attendant comes to me, and she says, would you like something to drink? I said, I'd like a Coke. And then she leans over in my ear. I've never seen this woman before. I probably wouldn't even recognize if I saw her again. And she said, God is not through with you yet. I'm trying to run from God. I said, what did you say? She repeated it. Then I turned to my friend who was one of the attorneys who were traveling with us, and I said, did you hear what she said? And he said, she said, God is not through with you yet. I'm trying to run from God, and God is chasing after, pursuing me. God is not through with you yet. Somebody here today, I don't know who it is, needs to hear those words. God is not through with you yet. Jonah, in the midst of the fish, he learns how to be thankful. Can you be thankful in hard times? We know how to be thankful in good times. We know how to be thankful in times of abundance. Can we be thankful in hard times when all hell is breaking loose? Can we be thankful then? When it seems like our nation is headed towards war or more war, and the world is just going in so many different directions that it's hard not to say, what the heck is going on? Can we still be thankful then? You see, the profoundness of verse 9 in this chapter not only helps us keep in mind how much Jonah is thankful for where God is leading him and what God is doing in his life, but in the middle of the whale, Jonah is trapped in a whale's stomach. He was trapped in 105-degree heat with only minimal air to breathe. Jonah, to make matters worse, was covered with this unpleasant gastric juices. And yet listen to the words that Jonah says. I will sacrifice to thee the voice of thanksgiving. In other words, Jonah said, I don't care where I am. I don't care what's going on. I don't care about the situation I'm in. No matter where I am, I can give thanks and praise to God. It's not easy. It's not easy. And I've shared off and on some stories about my journey after the death of Kathy. And I think one of the most difficult things for me was when someone came to me and said, well, Romans 8:28 says all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purposes. I said, I can't hear that right now. I couldn't be thankful in the midst of that situation because I could see no good coming out of a mother of 3 leaving 3 girls under the age of 10 prematurely because of cancer. I said, God, I've got to find a way to be thankful in the midst of this situation. And then I took that verse and I said, well, maybe if I understood this verse this way, that in all things God is working. I could wrap my mind around that in every situation that I face in my life, in every difficulty, in every setback, in every pain, God is at work. Everything I go through, God is working in and for and through me to bring me out. Yes, I can be thankful then. It's not turning out the way I want. It didn't end up the way I prayed, but in the midst of it, God is still at work. Preach, Kenneth. I tell you, I'm doing the best I can. Jonah is in the middle of the fish, and he says, I can still be thankful. What do you need to be thankful for? What do you need to be thankful for? Don't wait for a crisis. I'm not speaking just from head knowledge. I'm speaking from experience. Don't wait for a crisis in your life to find the need for God. I shared this story at the gathering of Lutheran pastors that was here on Friday. So this week has been just a really interesting week. I had to write a sermon for Friday, a sermon for today, a memorial service for today, and I said, man, I'm all preached out. But there's a story about this pilot who was flying. I said, don't wait for a crisis to go back to God, so hold that in your mind. There's this pilot that was flying from Akron, Ohio to LAX. And when he was about to land in LAX, he got on the intercom and he said that, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have an instrument landing today. Now, he's flying into LAX. The sky is clear, kind of like yesterday was. Not a cloud in the sky. No rain threatening, certainly no snow threatening in California. And he says, I'm going to have an instrument landing today. And the people, then he paused for a few moments, and everyone in the airplane started talking back and forth. Now, why would he do an instrument landing on such a clear day? Instrument landings are used for bad weather. It's almost as if the pilot heard the conversation that was going on in the cabin, and then the pilot came back on and he said, I know some of you are wondering why I used an instrument landing today. He said, I did that because I practice in good weather, so I'll be ready for bad weather. Don't wait for a crisis in your life and mine before we find a need for God. God has a search and rescue team looking for you, wherever you are, searching for you. Let's pray. Hi, I'd like to thank you for worshiping with us this morning via the internet. And I'd like to invite you to come and worship with us in person at our sanctuary. 15905 West Sunset Boulevard is our location, and we'll have a seat waiting for you. You can also visit us at www.plc.cc if you'd like to view other messages. Thanks again. Have a blessed day.